I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about horror in middle grade fiction. Now, I wanted to make something a little Halloween-y. It's almost time, and I've been doing Halloween craft projects and stuff like that, so I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about horror, and specifically in middle grade, because middle grade is this weird middle ground. You know, for children, like younger children, we've got tons of Halloween picture books, like the 10 Little Ghouls Go to the Market, and, you know, all these kind of fun, you know, holiday books. But I wanted to talk specifically about actual novels written for these middle grade set, because, you know, we all know about Goosebumps, but what about these other books that are maybe really scary, or parents are not quite so sure about them? And what do we do as writers when we're trying to write a book that's really scary, but we also don't want to scare off parents, and we want the gatekeepers to actually buy the books. We want the kids to read them and be scared, but not so scared that they don't kind of want to come back. It's this whole thing, right? I want to start with a quote. I'm going to read it here because I don't have it memorized, but it's from Neil Gaiman, who has written several horror books for kids. And he says, "Kids are so much braver than adults sometimes, and so much less easily disturbed. Kids will make their nightmares up out of anything. And the important thing in fiction, if you're giving them nightmares, is to demonstrate that nightmares are beatable." And that is the definition of a middle grade horror book. We want kids to know that they can beat their nightmares and their monsters. And they're still kind of in this age where some of them still think there might be monsters under the bed, and there might be monsters out there in the world. And so this is the way to kind of play around with those fears a little bit, but let them know that they can beat them too. You need a little bit, you know, we live in an age where kids do see things on television, and they see things in movies, and, you know, some parents are a little bit more guarded in what their kids watch, and some are not as much, and there's no judgment from me there. You do you, and you do what's right for your family and your kid. Some kids really love the horror genre, and they're really into Goosebumps and, you know, ghost stories and things like that. I am not the kind of person who likes to be scared. I don't watch a lot of horror. I do read it, but for some reason reading is a little easier for me to not like have nightmares afterwards. So I am much more a reader of horror than I am a viewer of it. But kids are kind of, they're hit with this stuff all the time, and they're familiar with it. They know what a mummy is. They know what ghosts are supposed to be, and you can kind of play around with that when you're writing for them. I want to make it clear, first of all, if you're writing for middle grade, that middle grade horror is not adult horror with younger characters. Just like when we talked about romance, and the difference between middle grade and young adult is crushes versus actual relationships and sex, middle grade horror is the scaring and the scary part without the gore. So when you're writing, and this is actually really hard because I was playing around with writing a horror story, and you have to have those kind of jump scares in there because you want to add the suspense and the terror, but you've also got to be really careful not to add in all that the gore and stuff that would make it basically PG-13 or R, right, if it was a movie. I think one of the best ways to make a story frightening without it being too scary is, even though you need to get like right into the action with a middle grade book, you need to ease them into the horror. So let's say that you started with like a haunted house, and there were rumors that people have gone missing in this haunted house. And then you set it up, right? So now we have the setup, and then you maybe have one of the characters' friends go into the haunted house, and she tells them not to go, and they don't come back. And then you have the characters decide they're going to go in and find their friend. And so you're slowly kind of working us into this so that it's scary and it builds suspense, and it's not too scary. We don't have people being murdered and like blood and gore and stuff like that, but we're kind of easing into it, right? So some of my tips, if you're writing a good horror book for middle graders, is the first thing is you need to have a believable but actually legit scary bad guy. Your villain, your antagonist, needs to be scary. And I know that there's some kind of books where like maybe the ghost isn't that bad once you talk to them or something like that. I know Han has written several books, but the ones I remember from my childhood, the ghosts turn out to be actually good, and so it really wasn't that bad at all. That's fine. That's kind of playing with that trope a little bit. But for the most part, if you're going to set up a really scary story, I think that we need to have that big baddie and him be legit scary. So I think a good example of this is Serafina in the Black Cloak by Robert Beatty. So I think a good example of this is Serafina in the Black Cloak by Robert Beatty. It's a really great kind of suspenseful book. It's set in an earlier time period. We've set up that Serafina is not fully human, which kind of gives us a little bit of easing into that world that I was talking about. And then we start setting up that, you know, animals are being killed and it's not good. And who could possibly be behind this? And then we start setting up the bad guy. And we know that the bad guy is really bad and he's very scary. And Serafina, even though she's strong and brave, is very scared of him too. And so there's all these little things that kind of get peppered in there to slowly introduce this bad guy, and he is bad. And it is fine for the bad guy to be bad, especially in horror. I think, honestly, for me, a scarier villain are the kind that have what almost seem like good in not intentions, but reasoning. You know, like you're like, man, if this guy wasn't just a little twisted, he would, I kind of understand him, you know, and that kind of throws me off a little bit when I'm reading books like that. Like, you want to root for the bad guy, but no, I shouldn't be because he's really, really bad. I did already mention that you should get into the action right away. And that's not just because it's middle grade, although that's very important. With that level of books, you need to just start. But also because we need to capture the reader and we need to get that suspense going right away. So I think a really good example of this is the Jumblies. Yes, Jumblies by Tracy Baptiste. It's a really great beginning, and it just captured me from the moment I read it. Like, I mean, first sentence, first paragraph, first page, I was on board because she got going right away. Then you have to find a way to create kind of a new spin. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. We're kind of all writing the same stories over and over. I've talked a little bit about Joseph Campbell and the power of myth. We're creating these stories, but there's a way to kind of create a new spin. Jonathan Stroud wrote this great series called Lockwood Company. I own several of them. I'm on like book 5 or 6. I think I'm on book 6. And the way that they've created is we've got a parallel universe where at a certain time period in history, a whole bunch of ghosts started showing up and only children can see them. And so they've created agencies where children go in to fight the ghosts because the adults can't see them. They know that they exist because people die, but only the children can really do anything about it. And so there's all these different agencies and child labor laws and working and stuff like that. And we've got these main characters who start their own agency, and they're young people. They don't have any adults overseeing them, called Lockwood Company. And as you would imagine, a group run by young teens, you got some problems. This book is, to me, a Bridger book. It's not quite young adults, but it's not quite middle grade, so it's kind of right there in between. You've got a very sick and twisted kind of bad guys and ghosts that are bad guys, and even if the ghosts have been good in life, the fact that they're dead seems to have done something to them. And so, you know, we constantly have this kind of creepy factor and these like small little ghost stories within a larger picture of a big case that they're studying and they're trying to learn about. The very first book is called The Screaming Staircase, and there is some blood and gore, but not in the way that you would think it would be, not Saw level gore, something completely different. And that's why it's different. It's a new spin on an old idea. You also have to give people a bit of breathing room in your books. You've got to let them have these moments where it's not constantly action all the time, not constantly a ghost. You need a little bit of a breath. Some people do that just through comedy. They add a little bit of humor into their stories, and so right when you're like totally in suspense, and then you can laugh and you can take a breath. Okay. A lot of movies do this, a lot of action movies, because you got to have that moment of brevity just so you can take a breath and not feel like you're constantly in the action. I think that a good horror book also has a little bit more going for it. It has something else besides the horror that's carrying the book through. So you still have your characterization, you still have a character arc, and you still have, wants and desires and interests that go beyond just, a mystery about whatever that they're trying to solve or whatever problem they're trying to fix. There's also the common trope of jump scares, which is harder to do in books. Jump scares are a little different, and I think that they can be very cheap if you do them badly. If the character turns around and they see this horrible, horrible face, and then they're like, oh wait, that's my brother, that's my sister in a mask, it kind of loses it a little bit in the book. So I don't think that with books it works as well to do jump scares as much as it works to do the slow dread, the build to like the feelings and all of that gets kind of caught up within, and it creates this kind of a thriller-esque thing, little things happening so that you get this feeling of just dread. It's also okay with middle grade horror to not have like a completely happy ending. Like characters die in horror books a lot of times, or people get hurt or things like that. So it's okay if everything doesn't end happily. What the kids need to know though is that they can defeat the monster. That's the important part of middle grade. They need to know that they can defeat the monster, even if the monster keeps coming back. So I think of like the book Tomb Quest, or the series Tomb Quest, where we have the first book and it kind of ends, right? But it's not done. We know that there's going to be a series. So even though they've defeated that monster for that book, we still got the big bad guys that we've got to defeat. And that's kind of the fun of a series, is you have like the overarching bad guy, and then you have a bad guy in every book, and you can do that with horror, and it's a lot of fun. I will say that with middle grade, as opposed to young adult and adult books, you have to be really careful with the occult. Adding in witches, which I've already mentioned, adding in things that are more occultish and like cult followers and things like that. You gotta be really careful with that, because editors don't want to touch it, and parents don't like to touch it either. Religion still plays a large part in our society, and you've got to keep that in mind when you're writing a book where you're trying to add horror and things like that. If you think about Goosebumps, they never really go into the occult. We just more have like a fantasy realm where these things exist, and so we have like these little bad guys and mysteries that have to be solved every book. So just be warned, if you decide to add that into your middle grade, you're going to have a hard time. If you shift it up into young adult, not a problem. And I've already addressed the fact that you should be careful about blood. Again, think of it as like PG versus PG-13 or R. It's okay to be a little scared. It's okay to have those feelings that something's going to jump out at any moment, but you don't want to draw a drop of blood. Or if it does happen, it happens off stage where we don't see it, and it happens somewhere else, and that's okay. So you can play around with that. And this is why middle grade is very different from young adult or adult books. And it's not like the little kid books where we got little ghosts and goals and we count to 10 or whatever that those books are. They're different. A horror book, which we hope outlives past the Halloween season, goes beyond that. We'll also say that when it comes to horror, middle grade readers really like series. They like to stick to characters for a long time, and they stick to authors. So if they run into an author who writes a horror book that they really like, they'll keep on reading. That's actually typical across the genre. This happens a lot where people kind of find that author that they really like and kind of gives them the right feels, and then they keep on reading. Stephen King fans are Stephen King fans, and they a lot of times keep on reading all of the books that Stephen King has written. Kids do that. They read the entire Goosebumps series, and they'll keep on reading all the Han books. Doesn't mean that you can't write a novel, But I'm just letting you know that this is very typical of this particular genre and this particular age level. Series sell really well, and series sell well to middle graders who want to keep reading them. And parents are more prone to buy books that are part of the next book in the series. They'll just keep on going and keep on buying the books for their kids. And that's what we want. Ultimately, we want the books to get into the hands of readers, not necessarily to make money, but because we want the kids to read them, and it is the parents who are buying them. And that's just the reality of it. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Ink. I hope your writing is out of this world.